Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be bringing you the updated version of the Shadow Minion Bomber build. Now this is the build that I made a little bit ago that is one-shotting bosses. And with patch 1.1.1, it's gotten even better. So with that, let's jump right into the build. All right, here, and the first thing that I want to start off with is our skill tree. Now taking a look at it, we're going to put 2 points in Reap and the Enhanced Tree. We're not going to be using this at all. It's just to get us to the next point on the skill tree. And then going down, we're going to be putting a point in Blight, Enhanced Blight, and then Supernatural Blight. And now this is another skill that we're not going to have on our bar, and the only reason we really have it is for this bonus right here, a 15% increased damage within Blight. Now thankfully to a legendary aspect that we have, our Bone Prison is going to spawn Blight, and it's going to give us a chance to do a massive lucky hit crit chance. So this is really important to have, but you're not actually going to have to use it, so it's really nice that you don't have to actually even touch it. Then next we are going to put 3 points into Hewed Flesh, just so we have more corpses on the ground. Then we move down here to Blood Mist, and of course we grab all of them up to the passive that gives you a corpse for every second. And Blood Mist here is basically just going to give us a ton of survivability. You know, with this build running a wand and a focus, we have a ton of cooldown reduction and lucky hit chance, meaning that our cooldowns come down pretty fast. And usually Blood Mist, you can be in it around 80 to 90% of the entire time you're in a Nightmare dungeon or when you're fighting a boss. Overall, it is super strong and just makes us super survivable. And with the aspects we're using, it actually turns into some shadow damage, and it does more damage for us, proccing our perk faster. Now moving down here, we are going to put a point into Corpse Explosion all the way up to Blighted Corpse Explosion, basically making this a darkness skill. Then we'll move over here to 3/3 for our Skeletal Warrior Mastery, basically buffing our Skeletal Warriors and giving them a ton of life and a ton of damage. Now of course we are using Bone Prison all the way down here to Ghastly Bone Prison, basically to guarantee that they are vulnerable. And now not only is Bone Prison basically going to do a little bit of damage, make them vulnerable, it's also going to be spawning that pool of blight underneath and helping to proc all of our other damage bonuses. Now we do put 1 point down here in Grim Harvest, and then really to get to Fueled by Death, you deal 9% increased damage for 6 seconds after consuming a corpse. We're constantly consuming a corpse, so this will be constantly up. Now moving down here to Death's Embrace, of course we're going to get some more damage and some damage reduction to close enemies. Really everyone should be close to you at pretty much all times. Now, a 3/3 into Amplify to deal increased damage to cursed enemies. We're going to be cursing enemies thanks to a Caged Heart that we're using. And then we have points in Decrepify all the way to Lucky Hit, basically making the, you have a 15% chance for your cooldowns to be reduced by 1 second. Now, this is really cool because we don't have to cast this. Thanks to the heart that we're going to be using, we're going to have an aura of Decrepify all around us. That's basically going to Decrepify everyone around us. So we have points in here just to get these passive abilities, basically. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this was bugged for a while where you weren't getting the bonuses just by having the heart. But from my testing in patch 1.1.1, that is now fixed. And you should be getting all of these bonuses, even for just running the heart and not even having it on your bar. Now to finish off here, we're going to put 3 more points into Skeletal Mage Mastery, again for some more health and some more damage for our Skeletal Mages. Now moving down here to Corpse Explosion, 1 point in here, all the way to Plagued Corpse Tendrils, basically giving us a higher chance for every enemy to be vulnerable. This is especially useful in Nightmare Dungeons where you're corpse tendriling pretty much everyone that is around you. Now we have a bunch of passive abilities that's going to give us a ton of damage, so let's look at those. So we have increased movement speed after using a darkness skill. This is really nice. Really, we're using it to get into the other perks. But overall, movement speed on a Necromancer is always nice to have. Now, 3/3 points for Gloom, basically making sure they take more shadow damage, and our minions are going to be doing more shadow damage overall. And Darkness skills deal 9% bonus damage to enemies who are slowed. They are always slowed thanks to Decrepify, and 9% damage bonus are stunned or immobilized. Thanks to Corpse Tendrils, that will also be stunning them, so we'll be doing a ton of bonus damages. And of course, these apply to our minions, making them even stronger as well. Now moving down here, we have some minion survivability built into the build. Inspiring Leader basically makes so that your minions gain some attack speed as long as they've been alive. Death's Defense, this is a really important one. Make sure your minions cannot lose more than 30% of their maximum life in a single hit. Basically making sure that your minions can't be one-shot by elites or bosses. And then we have another big one, Bonded in Essence. Every 5 seconds, your Skeletal Priest healing will heal your skeletons for an additional 60% of their maximum life. Now, I know I had some few questions last time here. What is the Skeletal Priest? And if you're not aware, the Skeletal Priest is what happens when you hit your summon ability when you have maximum skeletons. A skeleton figure that's a little bit bigger than skeletons will pop up out of the corpse and will buff your skeletons, dealing increased damage and healing them. This is basically just increasing that healing and making sure that your skeletons are constantly going to be alive. Now really, you just want to pop this every time you go into a fight. It's going to give them a really strong damage boost and keep them alive the entire time. Then to wrap it up with our skills, we have Bone Storm. Bone Storm is pretty much used in every build on Necromancer, as is by far the strongest ultimate ability and really the only one worth using. Now let's move on to the final perk, the Shadow Blight perk. Shadow damage infects enemies with Shadow Blight for 2 seconds. You and your minions deal 10% bonus damage to enemies with Shadow Blight. Every 10th time an enemy receives shadow damage from you or your minions while they are affected by Shadow Blight, they take an additional 22% damage. Now on its own, this is already super strong with Shadow Blight, and we have 2 perks that are actually going to make this even stronger. So overall, Shadow Blight is basically the front and center of this build. The huge crits you see from the Barber, yes, are there from the Barber, but the damage originally is really coming from Shadow Blight. That's what we're trying to proc here, and just proc it as often as we can, building up that damage and doing insane crits. So with that, let's take a look at the legendary aspects. All right, here we are in the legendary aspects, and as you can see, I have the aspects and the actual stats for each armor piece. Now we're not going to go through all the stats, but of course you can check these out in the description down below for this build guide. So with that, let's jump right into it. First, we have the aspect of Explosive Mist, basically making so our Explosive Mist absorbs corpses and casts Corpse Explosion automatically, and this is actually a separate cooldown from the heart that we're using that automatically cast Corpse Explosion. So that's really, really nice, especially for stacking as much damage as we can in that Barber time frame. Now, another thing that it does is it gives us cooldown reduction when we pick up corpses. This is super important as it's going to allow us to be in Blood Mist more often, and in Blood Mist we are completely invulnerable, making it even better. Next, we have our chest piece, which is a really common one, basically just increasing our skeletal mage count by 2. Now, the more skeletal mages we have is great because we actually need a certain amount of skeletal mages for the Ring of Mendelin to proc. Now, overall, this is really important to have, and the reason we choose mages over warriors is mages do shadow damage, and they do a lot of shadow damage, and we want as many mages as possible. Now, the warriors, they are nice and useful to have. They do damage, but they don't do near as much as our shadow mages. So just keep that in mind. You always want to be getting as many mages as possible. Now, next on the gloves, we have the aspect of decay. This is going to be the first thing that buffs our Shadow Blight key passive. So each time the Shadow Blight key passive deals damage to enemies, it increases the next Shadow Blight's damage within 10 seconds by 25 to 45%, stacking up to 5 times. This is super, super powerful. Basically just massively increasing our potential for damage in that Barber window. Now next we have the aspect of disobedience, basically just giving us a little bit of tankiness when we're not in Blood Mist. So you gain 0.25 to 0.5% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 15 to 30%. This is really nice because we're constantly going to be doing damage. We should pretty much constantly stay at 30% if you have the perfect roll. And overall, this is going to make us super, super tanky and super nice to have. Now, next we have the Ghost Walker aspect. This is actually a really important part of the build, and it might not clear it. It doesn't give us any damage, but what it does do is dramatically increase our clear times in Nightmare Dungeons. So what it does is while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% increased movement speed and can move freely through enemies, which means you won't be CC'd. Now, what does counts as unstoppable? Blood Mist. And since we're in Blood Mist almost always, we are always pretty much going to have that 10 to 25% increased movement speed and can move freely through enemies. This is super, super useful. It allows you to absolutely fly through dungeons. I mean, it is absolutely a top tier legendary aspect for the Necromancer since they are so slow. Next, we're going to move on to our jewelry, and with the amulet, the aspect of Grasping Vines. Gain 10 to 20% increased critical strike chance for 6 seconds when you cast Corpse Tendrils. You deal 20 to 40% bonus critical strike damage to enemies damaged by Corpse Tendrils. So this is going to proc for every single enemy that we hit, basically, as we're going to be auto-casting Corpse Tendrils. This is super, super important because this really does increase our proc rate for the Ring of Mendelin. And this is another huge aspect of our damage here. So this is super important to have, and we want to make sure we have it on the amulet to get the bonus 50% to the actual stats. Now moving on to the big unique in this build, and a lot of people are saying, oh my gosh, the Ring of Mendelin is so rare, I haven't gotten it. And while, yes, it is luck based, you know, you could go all the way to 100 and never get one. That is pretty unlikely. Like, I have 4 or 5 of these already. I think more than that. I think I've probably had 8 drop, and I've sold several of them that were, you know, non-ancestrals. And overall, it can be unfortunate if you don't have it yet, but this build still works without it. So if you don't have this, you can throw in another damaging aspect. There are plenty out there, and I can link some down in the description below. That are some other choices for you that might not have the Ring of Mendelin. Now, if you have the Ring of Mendelin, it is super strong, so let's talk about what it does. When you have 7 or more minions, you gain Lucky Hit, up to a 10% chance to empower all of your minions, causing the next attack from each to explode for physical damage. Now, this is really, really important because when this procs, it does absolutely insane damage. And the reason is when you combine this with the Barber, they do insane crits because it does insane amounts of physical damage that then is soaked up by the Barber, multiplied by a bunch, and then spit out as a huge crit. And overall, it just does absolutely insane damage to pretty much anyone around it. Now, moving on to our final ring, we have the aspect of Plunging Darkness. Now, this is actually a really important aspect, as Bone's Prison spawns a pool of blight that deals 75 to 125% bonus damage over 6 seconds. Now, why is this important? This gives us another way to proc our Shadow Blight passive, and it helps a ton having that dot to actually proc it constantly. Now, this is really, really important if you want to hit those huge crits, as this will basically make your Shadow Blight passive, the Shadow Blight key passive, constantly rolling and keeping it up constantly. This is very, very important, and this is a very, very strong aspect. Not only is this going to really help with bossing, but this really helps clearing Nightmare Dungeons and clearing big packs of elites. Now, next, I want to move on to our weapons, and as you can see here, we are using 2 weapons. We're specifically using a wand and a focus. Now, looking at the weapon, we're using the Blighted Aspect. You deal 50 to 120% increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. This is another massive buff to our Shadow Blight key passive, which is our main focus of damage in this build, basically giving us a ton of increased damage. Next, taking a look at our offhand, we have the Aspect of Ultimate Shadow. Now, this is really important for our Bone Storm, as without this, Bone Storm isn't really that great and it doesn't do a lot of damage, but with this, it's going to help proc our Shadow Blight key passive even more. Bone Storm and Bloodwave are now also darkness skills that deal shadow damage. Now, we don't care about Bloodwave, but basically, the Bone Storm is going to be turned into a shadow damage over time skill that does a certain amount of damage for a certain amount of seconds. Now, this is really, really nice to help proc our Shadow Blight key passive, specifically when bossing, as we want to fit as much time as we can in before the Barber explodes to get the maximum amount of crit damage. Now, next, let's take a look at the hearts that we are using in this build, starting with, of course, the Barber. This is by far the strongest Wrathful heart in the game and really makes a difference in this build. Critical strikes and all subsequent damage within 4 to 2 seconds is absorbed by your target. Then, the absorbed damage erupts onto surrounding enemies. Stored damage is increased by 15% per second. Now, for a perfect roll, it's going to depend on what you're doing. Now, overall, the 4-second timer is far better for bosses, as you can fit more damage in there to get multiplied. You're going to have much higher crits with a 4-second Barber roll. But the 2-second Barber roll is much better for Nightmare Dungeons and clearing mobs. And the reason is with the 4-second, when you're clearing mobs, sometimes there can be a while where you're not doing any damage and you know the enemy is already going to die. And so it just makes clear times a little bit slower, but overall you want to slot the higher roll that you have for those bosses, as that's what's going to make the biggest difference. Next, we have the Decrepit Aura, which we've talked about a little bit, basically making so that when you if you have the perfect roll, when you have 0 enemies near you, you gain basically an automatic aura that curses enemies around you. Now, if you have a perfect roll, this is going to be active all the time. Really, you want to get one that it is between 0 to 1 enemies near you, basically meaning so you have it all the time, including in boss fights. Then finally, we have the Sacrilegious, which is another very, very important heart into this build, which is basically going to auto cast our corpse skills for us when we are near a corpse. Now, it does come with a damage reduction. Now, at a Caged Heart tier 4, you can get all the way down to minus 20% reduced damage, which really is not that much, as it's not the main focus for build the actual damage, but more the shadow damage that's being cast automatically that is going to proc our Shadow Blight key passive. Now, as for gems, we want to run emeralds in our weapons for critical strike damage and rubies in our armor for maximum life. Now, here you can see the actual skills on our bar. We have the Raised Skeleton, Bone Storm, Bone Prison, Corpse Explosion, Corpse Tendrils, and Blood Mist. You will never cast Corpse Explosion or Corpse Tendrils. They will cast automatically, but they have to be on your bar to work with the Sacrilegious, so you can't remove them. So they have to be on your bar, but you won't ever use them. So that means you'll be only using 4 skills this entire time. You're going to be basically using Blood Mist off cooldown, Bone Prison when you get a huge group grouped together by Corpse Tendrils, or if you're a boss, this is the first thing you cast on a boss, and then you're going to be using Bone Storm into Blood Mist. So how this works on a boss scenario, you'll pop Bone Prison on the boss, then you'll pop Bone Storm, and then you'll try to pop Raised Skeleton if you have a corpse on the ground, and then Blood Mist. Now, ideally, you want to get into Blood Mist as fast as possible, but these two always come first. You always cast your Bone abilities first, and then Blood Mist. Ideally, you do want to get a Raised Skeleton in to summon your Priestess for increased damage before you're in Blood Mist, but that's not always possible. Now, in a Nightmare Dungeon, it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be more chaotic as you're running around. You're going to basically be proccing Blood Mist off cooldown, and I like to pop Bone Storm when there's big groups of elites. I use Bone Prison when a Corpse Tendrils basically groups everyone together, and basically anyone in that Bone Prison will die pretty much instantly. Now here is our Book of the Dead, where we're going to sacrifice the Golem because we just don't have room for it in this build. It takes up an ability on our skill bar, and that just really isn't worth it for any build right now. And next we have our Shadow Skeletal Mages, where they basically fire an additional attack every 4th attack, just more damage overall. And then we have our Skeletal Warriors on a Reaper, and they're going to be forming a corpse. Basically, they have a 15% chance to form a corpse every single time they attack, which the more corpses we have on the ground, the more damage we can do. Now, again, this is another place where you can see all of the different stuff that we want on all of our builds. Not going to be going over it as there's a lot to go over, but you can see it and go over it yourself. Now, finally, I do want to talk about the Paragon board real quick. We're not going to be going over in too grave a detail. We're going to be going over what boards to use and what glyphs to slot in them. So starting off with our starting board, we're going to be using Amplify for some bonus damage to cursed targets from ourselves and our minions. We're going to be going directly up to our Scent of Death. We're going to be using Control for, again, more damage. And we're going to be grabbing the passive that with at least 2 corpses nearby, you gain 15% damage reduction. And with no corpses nearby, you deal 15% increased damage. Now, this is always going to be benefiting us, whether we're more tanky or doing more damage, it's going to be great. Most of the time, we're going to be doing more damage with this, as we are pretty much popping corpses as soon as they fall on the ground, meaning there shouldn't be that many by us that often. Now, from here, we're going to go left here and grab the Bone Graft board real quick and slot in Exploit. We're not going to worry about the legendary passive right there. Then we're going to come back to Scent of Death, move up, and we're going to hit the Wither board. And here we are going to slot Scourge. Now, in the Wither board, you have an option. As you see right now, I do not have the legendary node Wither. But with patch 1.1.1, Wither was buffed and is actually quite a bit stronger than it was before. And so one option here is to actually put in about 25 points and go to this Wither node. And this is something that I've been testing out yet. And so far, it's hard to tell whether it's a DPS gain or loss. It is very, very close because you are losing stuff in other places. But overall, I do think this might be worth it. I'm still testing it, and when I know for sure, I'll definitely, update the description down below, letting you guys know, like, if it's for sure worth it, or if, it is a small DPS loss. Still trying to test this out, so I'm not sure where this is going to end up yet, but just keep that in mind that if you really want to use this, you definitely can. Now, next, we're going to go over to the Flesh Eater board, where we're, of course, going to grab the legendary node that basically gives us a constant 40% increase in damage. Now we are going to slot Essence in this, and then we're going to move up into our final board, which is Cult Leader, and we're going to slot Dead Raiser. So that is it for the Paragon board. Of course, this is here in detail on the written guide if you need it, and if you can pause the video at any time to copy it down if you need it. So that is going to wrap it up for our Shadow Minion Bomber build. Overall, this build is incredibly strong, especially when it comes to bossing. Now, overall, this build can clear Nightmare Dungeons extremely fast, all the way into tier 90s and tier 100s. Now, this build is by far the best boss build in the game. As you can see, it one-shots Lilith multiple times. I mean, this build is absolutely insane. The damage potential that it has, it is completely broken. Now, I don't think you have to worry about this build getting nerfed anytime soon, as they just actually buffed it in patch 1.1.1. And overall, this is a super strong build for those of you who like to run minions. Now, if you don't like to run minions, I actually have a crazy build that I just created, and it is up on the channel live right now. You can check it out in the card above. So with that, thank you everybody for watching. If you enjoyed, please hit that like and subscribe button, and I hope to see you guys in a future video.